Hello everyone, and welcome to BattleTech Faction Briefings. Today, we are finally covering the 5th Regiment of the Wolf's Dragoons. They have a short history due to the damage they take in several major battles. Despite that, they keep coming back and fighting harder. They have been called the Desert Wolves and the Harrowers. Today, we cover Wolf's Dragoons, Epsilon Regiment. Like all members of the Wolf's Dragoons, they use a team emblem of a snarling black wolf's head on a red background. The regimental symbol is a Greek epsilon. The mercenary symbol is painted on the right shoulder. The regimental symbol is painted on the lower right torso, and any battalion or squad emblems are painted on the legs. As for unit emblems, the command company has an annihilator silhouette on a large red sun. Abel uses a black griffin upon a white diamond. Baker uses crossed cavalry lances, and Charlie uses a charging hussar with a sword brandished overhead. The paint scheme that Epsilon uses is a solid tan color scheme. Their elementals use a dun and brown camo paint, also known as desert camo. They also have a painted wolf's head on their helmet with yellow eyes. This color scheme makes Epsilon stand out amongst the other Dragoons, but sadly, they look drab compared to the bright colors of many of the other squads. Like all regiments of the Wolf's Dragoons, Epsilon has a long history. If you want to skip spoilers, then go to the time listed. Epsilon Regiment was part of the original Dragoons, created in the clan homeworlds, as an inner sphere recon team. Many of the Epsilon soldiers were trained by Clan Goliath Scorpion, including their original regimental commander, Dana McGuire. The team was sent out to the inner sphere and arrived in 3005. The Dragoons took a contract with House Davian shortly after their arrival. They were sent on their first operation in 3006 as a deep raid on Styke in the Capellan Confederation. Alpha went with Epsilon, in addition to the 7th Commando. Their target was the Dow Mechworks factory in Hegemony Bay City. The operation began with the commando unit sneaking in and causing fires and power outages throughout the area. This tricked the 4th Confederation Reserve Cavalry into thinking it was a minor rebellion. The commandos were able to draw the Capellan forces away from the city so that the Dragoons had an easy landing. The main Dragoon forces landed with 3 dropships around Hegemony Bay. They took out local defenders quickly and damaged local mech factories. The 4th rushed back to Hegemony Bay, but were delayed by airstrikes from Dragoon fighters. Meanwhile, commando hovercrafts assaulted Liao naval forces. After 2 hours of fighting, the Dragoon forces left the world with minimal losses. Their victory helped boost the reputation of the Dragoons due to their skill at conducting the operation. In January 3007, Epsilon was stationed on New Valencia with Delta and Gamma, when 5 regiments of McCarran's armored cavalry showed up. Gamma Commander Korsht took command and had the Dragoon dependents evacuated before the enemy arrived. Then, the Dragoons took up defensive positions as they endured the siege. The nearby city took heavy damage during the fighting. The Dragoons had lower numbers, but they still held the line. But the tide did not turn until 3 regiments of the Iridani Light Horse arrived as support. Realizing things were going badly, Big Mac reluctantly retreated. Throughout the rest of the year, Epsilon conducted multiple raids, including one on Poznan. This was a quick victory, like many of the other raids conducted by the Dragoons. In March 3008, all regiments of the Dragoons teamed up with 5 high-tier Davian units to attack New Aragon. The world of New Aragon was guarded by 8 Liao regiments. The Capellans had taken the world earlier that year, so this was a necessary counterattack. In preparation for the attack, small raiding teams were sent to nearby planets to function as distractions. The main Davian force took on the 1st and 2nd Ariana Fusiliers, Fremont's Cuirassiers, and Trimaldi's Secutors. The 5 regiments of the Wolf's Dragoons were teamed up with the 4th Deneb Light Cavalry and faced off with the 1st and 2nd Kearney Highlanders, McCormick's Fusiliers, and the Waco Rangers. The arrival was met with disaster, as the 4th Deneb's dropship took damage from aerospace fighters. and after a rough landing, their unit was out of the battle for a week as they repaired and reorganized. The Dragoons' ships were hit hard as well, but they recovered and pushed forward with the attack. The Dragoons tried to soften up the Highlanders with artillery, but the opposition held strong. Epsilon Regiment was able to make progress with a daring night attack, but still took heavy losses securing their position. The other Davian forces were also having trouble, so Jamie Wolfe came up with a plan. He sent the 7th Commandos with light mechs from Alpha and Gamma regiments to drop behind the defenders of El Diablo Pass. Then, Zeta Regiment hit the pass from the front, and the Waco Rangers took heavy damage, including the death of their recon commander, Lieutenant John Waco, who was accidentally killed by being stepped on after ejecting from his Wasp. The rest of the Dragoons followed Zeta and easily dealt with McCormick's Fusiliers. After that, the Capellan forces were overrun, and the world was won for the Federated Sons. In 3009, after their contract ended, the Wolf's Dragoons returned to the clan homeworlds to report on the current state of the Inner Sphere. The round trip would take them months to complete. In mid-3010, the Dragoons took up a contract with the Capellan Confederation. A team made up of Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon were sent to Wallachia. They defended the world from a Free Worlds League offensive. Delta took the lead with mobile defense. Meanwhile, Gamma and Epsilon worked together to strike the rear lines of the Marik forces, destroying their supplies. However, FWLM reinforcements arrived, which caused the Dragoons to give up the world. To make matters worse, Epsilon Commander Colonel Dana McGuire was severely wounded in an accident. This led to his retirement, and Major Harold Jones would take command. The team was sent to defend Scarborough as the planet was attacked by the Fusiliers of Orente. The Dragoons were ready and used similar defense tactics that they had used on Wallachia. However, they were outmaneuvered by the Fusiliers. Epsilon was isolated, but rallied and linked up with Delta, taking a strong defensive position. Gamma was left alone on the Samho Plains. After several days of brutal fighting, Gamma was able to break the lines and link up with the rest of the team. Despite their efforts, the Dragoon team had to flee the world. In 3012, the team was moved to Shiro 3 to hold off the Marik offensive. This would be the final battle of this campaign. The Dragoons were teamed up with several Capellan units to fight the Marik forces. The battle was successful, with Colonel Jones showing off his tactical skills by conducting daring attacks to hold off the Marik forces. After the fighting came to an end, the Dragoons were stationed on Carver 5. The Dragoons would face some odd issues with the Liao family. In 3013, Candace Liao came to Carver and attempted to seduce Jamie Wolfe. When she failed, she attempted to seduce Epsilon Commander Harold Jones. After a couple weeks, she got frustrated and left the world. Shortly after Candace Liao returned to Cyan, 2 attempts were made on Jamie Wolfe's life, and both attempts failed. Then, in 3014, a deal was struck between Maximilian Liao and Anton Marik. This would lead to the Marik Civil War, and the Dragoons were brought in to assist Anton's faction. Epsilon and Delta were held in reserve during the beginning of the war in defense of Anton's base on New Delos. In September 3014, Epsilon and Delta were sent to Sophie's world with the 3rd Marik Militia. The world was defended by the 1st Atrean Dragoons, 6th Marik Militia, the Headhunters, and 3 regiments of local militia. The rebel forces endured loyalist hit-and-run attacks designed to lead the rebels into ambushes by heavy and assault class mechs of the 1st Atrean. Due to issues with Anton's timetable, Alpha Regiment arrived to support the rebel forces. Alpha landed on the other side of the Atrean Dragoons, trapping them between Alpha and Delta. The Atrean Dragoons were broken, and that caused their allies to flee the world. Despite the drawn-out fight, Epsilon only sustained minor casualties. After that, Epsilon was sent to Acilius Australis, where they took the world with very little trouble. In December, Epsilon went to Fuentes, where they assisted the 5th Regulan Hussars and 7th Ducal Guards, who were under attack by Smithson's Chinese bandits. The arrival of Epsilon caused the bandits to flee without much of a fight. In early 3015, Delta and Epsilon were sent to protect Emrys 4 and hold off a loyalist counterattack by the 2nd Fusiliers of Orente. The attackers took heavy losses compared to the minimal losses suffered by the Dragoons. Epsilon was shifted to the defense of Second Chance. Not long after they arrived, the Dragoons would learn that Anton Marik had taken Joshua Wolf and 27 Dragoon civilians hostage. The majority of the Dragoons went out to avenge their people. However, Epsilon remained on Second Chance to protect the rest of the Dragoon civilians. After the war ended, the Dragoons took up a contract with the Free Worlds League. This led to a time of recovery and rebuilding for the majority of the Dragoons. There were minor raids into Lyran territory, and Epsilon faced no major battles. The biggest operation during the Marik contract was the assault on Hesperus II. In 3019, the Dragoons took a roundabout route to Hesperus to throw off the LCAF, but a Lyran spy found out about their main target. By the time the Dragoons arrived on Hesperus II, the planetary defenses had been reinforced by several LCAF and mercenary forces. The Lyran forces consisted of the 6th, 15th, and 24th Lyran Guards, 3rd Royal Guards, Heezen Hotheads, and Hansen's Rough Riders. On the 6th of June, Alpha, Beta, and Gamma endured heavy air cover while attempting to land on World. They were scattered and far from their objectives. This gave the Lyran forces plenty of time to dig in and hold off the Dragoons. Both Delta and Epsilon were kept in reserve, but Jamie Wolf called them in as backup due to the fierce fighting. Epsilon joined up with Zeta in a push through the mountains, but the whole of the Dragoons were stopped at the Erawan River. One of the early attempts to cross the river was led by Alpha, with Gamma, Zeta, and a battalion of Epsilon. The resistance was so great that they had to pull back, and the Epsilon battalion never even crossed the river. The next attempt was led by Epsilon, with their colonel making a plan based on the results of the previous battle. Epsilon made their move with fighter escort to hold off enemy air attacks. However, enemy depth charges hit their marks, and Colonel Jones was killed, and Epsilon retreated. In a third attempt, Epsilon made it to the other side, but faced such great resistance that they had to return back to Dragoon lines. Despite the setbacks, one final push was planned. The Black Widow Company would lead a team through a narrow pass and hit the factory complex from the flank. Beta and Zeta were sent out to the Erawan River as a distraction force, while the Black Widows, alongside Delta and Epsilon, made their move. Delta and Epsilon held off Lyran troops, and the Black Widows made it to the factory, but were beaten back by Hansen's Rough Riders. Even when Delta and Epsilon joined the Widows, the Lyran forces had regrouped, and the Dragoon team had to retreat. After weeks of fighting, the Wolf's Dragoons had no choice but to abandon the mission. After the battle, Jamie Wolf and a few others headed to clan space for report and resupply. In the Inner Sphere, the Dragoons began recruiting elite-level mercenaries to join their units. In early 3020, the Dragoons would start a contract with House Steiner. In September 3021, a preemptive strike was planned on Draconis 6 to stop a potential Combine invasion. Alpha, Delta, and Epsilon, along with 3 regiments of Donegal Guards, were sent to Draconis. They faced off with the 3rd and 22nd Dairon Regulars, and the 2nd Sword of Light. The Kurita forces gave the Dragoons a good challenge, destroying a good part of Delta and almost killing Jamie Wolf. Despite losses, the Dragoons were successful and prevented the invasion. Due to issues with Lyran Command, Jamie Wolf used an escape clause in the contract to leave the Commonwealth in 3022. Shortly after that, they took up a contract with the Draconis Combine. In 3023, Epsilon and the Black Widows were sent to Hoth, where they teamed up with the 17th Galdon Regulars. The raid was designed to attack a Federated Suns research facility. The base was defended by the 151st Light Horse Regiment and the 17th Battalion of the 21st Striker Regiment from the Iridani Light Horse, as well as elements of the Draconis March Militia. The team used probing attacks to push back the ELH forces. A coordinated attack was planned, but the regulars jumped the gun and charged at dawn. This gave the Light Horse an opportunity to flank the Dragoons. The team rallied and countered by taking control of the battle due to the obtuse maneuvers of the Black Widows. The Widows took the facility, but found out all the useful information had been moved from the world. Despite the limited spoils, the destruction of an enemy lab was considered a victory. In 3024, Epsilon was once again teamed up with the Black Widows to raid Remus III, known as Corsidon. They faced off with the 3rd Davian Guards and Lyndon's company. The Widows took out an ammo depot, and during the week of fighting, Owen Lyndon, the commander of Lyndon's company, died. Epsilon was primarily used as a mop-up unit, as the Widows led the charge. After the battle, Warlord Samsonov tried to show that Epsilon did a sloppy job, but Jamie Wolfe defended his team. This was just a small part of the growing tensions between the Draconis Combine and the Dragoons. House Davian pulled a counter-raid in 3025 and hit the Dragoon base on Thestria. The first Chisholm's raiders attacked Dragoon supply depots. It was a struggle, but Epsilon was able to repel the raiders. However, the attack was too well planned to be a random raid. There was no proof that anyone leaked information about the Dragoon base to House Davian, but it does seem likely that the Dragoons were betrayed. In 3026, Epsilon was worn down due to supply issues and difficulties with the DCMS. A year later, Epsilon joined up with the Black Widows to raid Bennett III, but their DCMS support never arrived, and the Dragoons needed to get assistance from the bounty hunter in order to escape the world. This would be followed by Samsonov claiming that Epsilon was too aggressive in their efforts to fight rebel forces on Kawabe, which wasn't true. By the end of 3027, Colonel Arbuthnot and part of Epsilon went to Anting to discuss grievances with Jamie Wolfe. In early 3028, fighting broke out on Anting between the Dragoons and Samsonov's forces. The Dragoons won and began their evacuation of the Draconis Combine. All 5 regiments of the Dragoons, along with Zeta and the Black Widows, gathered on Misery to fight the Draconis Combine. As the Dragoon civilians were evacuated, the Combine arrived with 4 regiments of Ryukin, the 17th and 21st Gale Dawn Regulars, and the 8th Sword of Light. Despite being outnumbered, the Dragoons put up a strong fight in one of the largest battles they would ever face. A week into the battle, Epsilon's Charlie Battalion did a long-range attack against a Ryukin base. However, they got ambushed by a reinforced battalion of the Sword of Light. The enemy battalion was destroyed, but Charlie took 70% losses. Nearly 2 weeks later, Epsilon went after a Ryukin position, and they were able to break their lines, which helped lead to the end of the battle. The victory came at a high price for the Dragoons, with them losing almost 50% of their forces. After the Battle of Misery, the regiments of the Dragoons were reorganized. Epsilon became 4 provisional companies with a command lance. Their conventional forces were moved to Robinson as part of the Home Guard. In total, Epsilon had 52 mechs. They made their way to Harrow's Sun with Gamma Regiment. It wasn't much longer before the 8th Gale Dawn Regulars attacked. The Kurita forces attacked civilian locations in order to call out the Dragoons. Thus, 2 companies were sent out to fight the regulars and draw them into a trap. Using natural defenses, the weak Dragoons were able to hold the line and leave before the regulars were able to properly counterattack. The regulars would press forward and attack the Dragoon base. However, they had to deal with artillery and minefields before facing the Dragoons. It took nearly a month for the regulars to breach the Dragoon defenses. The Dragoons fled their fort and went to a backup location that was protected by more minefields and natural defenses. As the battle continued, the use of hit-and-run attacks and defensive positioning allowed the Dragoons to survive against the Kurita numbers. The Kurita forces got the upper hand when their infantry tunneled into the Dragoon position to cause havoc as Kurita battle mechs charged forward. In this Kurita push, Colonel Arbuthnot was killed. Not long after, 2 more of the Epsilon Company commanders died. The Dragoons were pushed to the spaceport, where their dropships gave them enough cover fire to mount an escape. After defending the world for nearly a year, the Dragoons had to flee. After the battle, Epsilon had only 20 mech warriors, with 7 more injured. They barely had enough mechs to field along with their team, many of which were heavily damaged. Captain Nicole of the 4th Company was the only surviving senior officer. The remains of Gamma and Epsilon made their way to Crossing in order to meet up with the remainder of the Dragoons. In total, the Dragoons only had enough mechs to field a regiment's worth of soldiers, and had some support from the 10th Deneb Light Cavalry. The Kurita forces arrived in September 3029 with 4 regiments of Gale Dawn Regulars. This group was made up of the 6th, 8th, 12th, and 16th Gale Dawn Regulars. All 4 units had only been brought back to strength with fresh green soldiers. They also had an elite mech company called the Sword of Void as backup. Jamie Wolfe called the approaching enemies and gave them a meeting location. This was to protect the civilian population of the world. The Dragoons took a defensive position and held off the Gale Dawn Regulars. The Sword of Void attempted a drop operation against the Dragoons, but the Dragoons held their ground as the 10th Deneb came in and struck the Gale Dawn Regulars from the rear. Then, Zeta Battalion finally showed up, having fully recovered. This allowed the Dragoons to take out the Sword of Void. The 5th Gale Dawn were destroyed as they tried to escape. The 16th surrendered to Natasha Kerensky's unit. The 8th and the 12th attempted to retreat while being ravaged by Inferno rocket-equipped infantry. The surviving Krita soldiers fled the world. The Dragoons had won despite the extreme odds against them. After the Battle of Crossing, Epsilon was in bad shape. They were only able to field 19 units during the fight, with 3 pilots getting killed and 7 more injured, with 2 so severely injured they were no longer capable to serve in the Dragoons. The low numbers made Epsilon a dead unit for years. The remains of the Dragoons moved to Outreach, a world given to them by Hans Davian after the war. As the Dragoons reorganized and rebuilt, 4 of Epsilon's pilots ended up joining the Black Widow Battalion so they could return to the mission roster in 3031. By 3039, Epsilon was somewhat functional, and joined the rest of the Dragoons and some elite Davian forces on CAF, in preparation for an invasion of Dairon. The DCMS made a preemptive strike by sending in the Ryukin Ni and Ryukin San to CAF. They were sent to buy time for the fortification of Dairon. The Ryukin team attacked supply depots and hit the Davian forces as hard as they could before retreating from the world to help fortify Dairon. Despite the short battle, Epsilon took moderate damage due to their already weakened state. Epsilon wasn't fully rebuilt until 3042, and in 3046, Elizabeth Nicole would be promoted to the commander of the regiment. Under her command, she took on operations in order to rebuild the reputation of Epsilon. They would quickly regain a status that held them alongside the best of the Dragoons. When the clan invasion started in 3050, all the Dragoons were called back to Outreach in order to discuss how to deal with the crisis. Epsilon was on contract to House Marik, but had their contract ended to return to base. It was decided to help the Inner Sphere. Thus, they called up the leadership of the Inner Sphere to teach them about clan methods and tactics. After that, the Dragoons were sent to Luthien to support the Draconis Combine defense of their capital. The Wolf's Dragoons teamed up with the Kellhounds and the most elite troops the Combine had. The world was attacked by Clan Novacat and Clan Smoke Jaguar. Epsilon was key in fighting off the Novacat forces. It was several days of intense fighting, but the combination of Inner Sphere forces were successful in driving off the clans. By 3053, Epsilon Regiment was rebuilt and sent on a mission to Relevo in the Capellan Confederation. They were set as defense while Alpha was sent out to raid the St. Ives border. However, after Luthien, tensions started to grow inside the Dragoons. This would come to a boil in 3055 when Elsin Novacat and Alpin Wolf pulled a coup against Jamie Wolfe. Colonel Nicole and many members of the Epsilon command staff got food poisoning, making Elsin Novacat, the commander of Epsilon's elemental forces, the de facto leader of Epsilon during an important meeting. Elsin put up a challenge on behalf of Alpin Wolf and won, which put Alpin and Elsin in charge of the Dragoons. Jamie demanded a trial of refusal against the new leadership. The majority of Epsilon supported the new leadership, so Colonel Nicole publicly endorsed the Ilsen faction. However, half of Epsilon was off-world at the time. Thus, only part of Epsilon was able to fight for the Ilsen faction, but many soldiers started to have mixed feelings about the new leadership and their use of clan terminology. As Epsilon advanced against Jamie Wolfe's forces, they faced off with a training cadre made up of Karita recruits. Despite their numbers advantage, Colonel Nicole would call for her troops to pull back when things got too heated. She chose to fight a defensive battle due to not being too enthusiastic about fighting other Dragoons. This let Jamie's forces to focus on fighting Beta Regiment, who had very little backup. Not long after that, Jamie's forces were victorious. After the battle, Colonel Nicole kept her position as leader of Epsilon, and not long after, they would be out on missions once again. In 3058, the Jade Falcon incursion into the Lyran Alliance led to the Battle of Coventry. Gamma and Delta had been sent to assist the Lyran forces. Later, Epsilon joined Alpha and Beta as part of Victor Steiner Davian's Coventry Relief Forces. Victor's team arrived and ended the battle by offering the Falcons Hijira. This ended the fighting without Epsilon joining the battle. When the FedCom Civil War broke out, Epsilon was contracted to the Federated Commonwealth and stationed on Kisai 4, where they were assisting with training new FedCom Academy graduates. They refused to get involved in any of the fighting against the Lyran Alliance or the Draconis Combine. Sadly, in 3064, while returning to Outreach, a jump ship accident led to the loss of 3 dropships, which killed many support staff and most of Charlie Battalion. On Outreach, Epsilon took time to rebuild and build up to the new version of regimental team that General Maeve Wolfe had made the standard for all Dragoons. On 15 October 3067, Outreach was attacked by a team of mercenaries under contract to the Ward of Blake. The enemy mercenary forces were made up of the Waco Rangers, Smithson's Chinese Bandits, the Tiger Sharks, and the 51st Dark Panzer Jaegers. The team was led by the Waco Rangers, who still had a grudge against the Dragoons. To make matters worse, Ward of Blake ROM agents also pulled off terrorist and sabotage attacks. The Chinese bandits pulled off a bombing raid on the airfields and the Dragoon barracks. This weakened their aero fighters and killed many off-duty soldiers along with Dragoon civilians. The Tiger Sharks pulled off a surprise attack on the Home Guard. The Panzers worked with the Rangers to destroy the Hiring Hall, Wolf Hall, and capture the spaceport. This surprise attack caught Epsilon off guard and had many of them getting killed in the early part of the battle. Zeta and the Spiders were the first to arrive as reinforcements. Losses were heavy, with Epsilon being all but destroyed. The Home Guard was barely holding together, thus the remains of both units were used to fill spots in Beta, Zeta, and the Spiders. Jamie Wolfe had been leading the forces against Wayne Waco. Waco was killed, but after the fight, Jamie Wolfe also died from wounds sustained in the battle. The loss of soldiers and equipment was extremely high, but they did defeat the enemy forces. However, civilian casualties reached 250,000. The slightly rebuilt Beta and Zeta pressed forward with assistance from the Dismal Disinherited. They went on a revenge mission against the Ward of Blake at Mars. This would lead to the complete destruction of Beta and Zeta in the course of the battle. This would be the end of Epsilon Regiment for nearly 90 years. After the Battle of Terra and the near destruction of the Wolf's Dragoons, Henry Hack Kincaid took command and began a process of rebuilding. This included building the lost regiments of Delta and Epsilon. Within a short time, Epsilon was built into 2 battalions, made up of new recruits and survivors of other units. As things stand, they are preparing to take revenge against Clan Wolf. Epsilon is a regiment that had some major dark times, but they also have a few strong moments too. They do not have the fame of Alpha or Beta, and their history makes it clear as to why that is. They were often a backup team or kept in reserve, making them not very interesting. Yet, in the Ill-Clan era, they were one of the first regiments rebuilt by Colonel Kincaid. Perhaps the current era will prove a better run for the often troubled unit. Despite a troubled history, there are still some notable pilots in Epsilon Regiment. Dana Maguire, believed to be a Clan Goliath Scorpion Freebirth warrior who joined the Dragoons. The original commander of Epsilon until 3010, where he was injured and had to retire. He would die in 3024 from natural causes. His primary mech was a heavy or assault type. Harold Jones. He took command in 3010 and grew popular with his troops. He was a serious commander who prepared his operations meticulously, but he would die in the Battle of Hesperus II. His main battle mech was a heavy or assault type. Baxter Arbuthnot. He became the commander in 3019 While he didn't have the look of a warrior due to being very thin, he was respected for his skills. He was known for going into battle rages when things were desperate. He died on Harrow's Sun in 3028, a loss mourned by many. He piloted an unlisted heavy or assault mech. Elizabeth Nicole. In the late 3020s, she came to command the 3rd Company of Charlie Battalion. She proved her skill at Harrow's Sun by utilizing masterful hit-and-run attacks. She became able commander in 42 and took regimental command in 46. She would side with Elson Novacat in the Dragoon Civil War, but put out minimal effort and remained in command after the war. She died in the Battle of Outreach. She piloted a catapult, which was destroyed on Misery, then an enforcer. Later in her career, she piloted a clan assault omnimech. Elson Novacat. A bondsman brought into the Dragoons after the Battle of Luthien. He became the commander of Epsilon's elemental forces, but was also responsible for starting the Dragoon Civil War. He would be heavily wounded during the Civil War, but would remain with the Dragoons afterwards. He would die in 3070 while fighting the Word of Blake. Stuart Fields. He was the commander of Able prior to 3027, known for his battle scars and cybernetics, as well as his love of tennis. He has a dislike of House Carita due to Epsilon's treatment. He died on Harrow's Sun as commander of the 1st Provisional Company. He piloted a Battlemaster. Michael Mercier. He was a company commander in Baker Battalion who was known for always being late. He had a rough relationship with Danielle Rondima of Beta Regiment. However, his skills on the battlefield were much better than his interpersonal skills. He died on Harrow's Sun around the same time Rondima died on Waka Panetta. He piloted a Battlemaster. Eric Gamble. He began as part of Alpha Regiment, but was transferred to the Wolfsbane Striker Battalion in 3139. Then, he became part of the Black Widow Battalion before the Battle of Terra, and after being heavily wounded in the fighting, he recovered and was made the commander of the new Baker Battalion of Epsilon. He piloted a Vulture Mad Dog Omnimech. Andrew Kroll. A mech warrior who focused on the unit over the individual. His training methods and strategy helped him earn victories and survive the Ill Clan trial. In 3151, he was made the commander of the new Able Battalion of Epsilon. He pilots a WR-DG-02FC War Dog. Like all members of the Dragoons, Epsilon had a variety of battle mechs and omni-mechs. Generally, they have a focus on mechs with high maneuverability or high defense, as they tended to fight with hit-and-run tactics or defensive positioning. They also added conventional weapons to their companies, rather than making them separate units. Prior to 3055, they used 2 fighter lances, 3 infantry platoons, 6 vehicle platoons, 2 artillery platoons, and 2 to 4 land-air mechs per battalion. By the end of the Battle of Misery, Epsilon had lost all their LAM units. Their command company was made up of 2 lances, 2 artillery platoons, and 1 infantry platoon. However, after 3055, they fielded 1 lance, 2 stars, a point of fighters, a point of elementals, and a recon team made up of 4 vehicles and 1 scout mech. All battalions were made up of 1 command lance with 3 companies of mechs. That formation was also how they fielded their armor. Their elemental forces were made up of a command point and 3 stars of elementals. Interestingly, Able Battalion did not have a nickname until around 3067, when they were dubbed the Conquistadors. They used combined arms formations. Baker was called Jarrett's Lancers, and later Jean's Lancers. They used precise strikes and jump-capable mechs. Charlie was called Hussein's Hussars, then later Dwayne's Hussars, and finally Eric's Norsemen. They liked bold rushes, but are best known for using heavy armor. Devil Battalion, Epsilon's armor team, was called Easy Money. Finally, Eagle Battalion, the elemental team, was called Talbot's Smashers. They were most often used for recon and ambushes. Due to being rebuilt several times, Epsilon tends to have top-of-the-line gear. This means they can deploy an interesting mix of units. There are several entries in the fiction that have appearances by Epsilon. However, some of the stories are just minor appearances, and Shadows of Faith was an incomplete book that was part of Battlecore and hard to find. There is an odd mix of source books for Epsilon due to the gaps in their functional history. However, there is still a good amount of information, and as always, there are several books that only feature location and formation data. Last time I said I wasn't sure what to expect with Epsilon. While Gamma and Delta provided some surprises, Epsilon did not. They feel like the team that the writers didn't know what to do with. I get the feeling that the reason why Delta and Epsilon remained dead for the Dark Age was just so the writers didn't have to come up with things for them to do. Overall, they are the most lackluster unit of the 5 core regiments, but they do have some good moments. I'm glad I covered them. Still, it would have been nice if they had had more interesting stories in their history. I do not think there's a reason to paint up a set of Epsilon for the tabletop. The only reason to do so would be to have a complete set of all 5 Dragoon regiments. The boring tan paint scheme doesn't help either, as it isn't as vibrant or recognizable as the other members of the Wolf's Dragoons. If you have made a set of them, let me know, but I get the feeling the more popular units get the paint-ups. Next time, I will be exploring Zeta Battalion, the all-assault mech team of the Wolf's Dragoons. After that, I will be exploring the Black Widow Company and their spin-off units. In October, I'll be getting back to smaller mercenary forces and house units. If you have a suggestion, let me know so I can start my prep work for future videos. As I wrap up, I want to thank all the new subscribers. May your weapons stay hot and your reactors stay cool. Look forward to the next BattleTech faction briefing, and until then, I'll see you at the tavern.